Many years ago, the lockback was invented. It's a locking mechanism that is extremely simple. Essentially, you have this seesawing bar right here that locks the knife in place, and it also keeps the knife retained within the handle in the closed position. Stops both positive and negative force being moved on the blade in the open position. Extremely simple, extremely effective, extremely affordable. There's a reason we're still using it for how many years it's been. And you can watch my video on how it works a little bit more in depth. I have plenty of videos you can look at. That's one of them. Later, in more recent years, we came out with the triad lock, or I didn't anyway, Cold Steel did, more specifically Andrew Demko, one of their knife and locking mechanism designers. Basically the exact same locking mechanism, the only main difference being the inclusion of this integral stop pin that is in between both the tang of the blade and the end of the lockback lock bar. Everything else is pretty much exactly the same. It functions the same. We have a black torsion bar at the very end, and you can see him putting pressure up against the lock bar. You can see that's the torsion bar right there, that black bar you see within the handle. Cold Steel Voyagers, by the way, old model, newer model. Constantly putting pressure on that lock bar, pushing them upward. That's what causes them to seesaw back into place as soon as you let go of them. Same exact thing happens on the triad lock. Notch in the blade gets fit into by the L shape in the lock bar when it times up with it. Same exact thing occurs with the lockback lock bar. Again, it functions exactly the same. The Cold Steel triad lock we see on the left and the regular lockback that everyone can use function exactly the same. The biggest difference just being the stop pin. You notice anything different about these two locking mechanisms? On the left, we have a stop pin. On the right, on the regular lockback, we do not. That's basically it. And on top of that, with the triad lock, we also typically have a deeper cutout made in the tang of the blade. So it becomes even more difficult to depress it. If you look very closely, how much more you have to lift there in comparison to a typical lockback. Just a little bit more. Any lockback could function that way. It just so happens that on the triad locks, they tend to make the cutout even deeper within the tang of the blade. We have an even longer L shape on the lock bar. So what makes that so special? What makes just that simple stop pin right there in between the tang of the blade and the end of the lock bar, what makes it so much stronger than the lockback? Because it's significantly stronger. It's not just slightly stronger, it's not just a notch above it, it's much, much, much stronger. In fact, the lockback being a pretty strong locking mechanism, the triad lock is one of the strongest in the world. I would say it's next to probably the Ram Safe lock, also made by Cold Steel, the Balisong, the Paratrooper style folder. So why does this stop pin make it just that much stronger? Such a simple inclusion, such a simple thing. Basically, if you saw my lockback video, let me recap here. The lock bar counts as the stop pin. It's the stop bar. What does a stop pin or stop bar do? Essentially, it just stops the blade from over traveling. When you open the knife up, when you rotate the blade in place, it locks in place and no longer moves any further once it's in the designated open position. If there were no lock bar here, it would just keep going and going and going. But that's what stops it in place. With the triad lock, the stop pin is what is responsible for stopping it from over traveling, which is what you see on a lot of locking mechanisms. Liner locks, frame locks, they all have an integral stop pin. While the liner lock, which is normally down here, would stop the blade from going down this way. That's negative force if you were to accidentally smack the spine against something or whatever. Instead, we have a lock bar stopping the negative force of the blade from disengaging it, and then we have a pin stopping the positive force from having it over travel. Back in the day, with a lockback, or modern lockbacks, I don't know why I said back in the day, we're still using them, but with lockbacks, the bar right here is responsible for stopping both the over travel caused by positive force and disengagement from negative force going on the spine. With the triad lock, we have two separate parts doing two different things. Stop pin stopping the positive force from making it over travel, and the lock bar stopping it from disengaging from negative force on the spine. So because we have two separate parts here, that cuts the work down 50-50 essentially for the two parts. Because every time you open and close the knife, every time you use it, every time force goes on here and shock waves go through the knife and onto the locking mechanism, you wear it. It wears and it wears and it wears very lightly. It would take years and years and years for you to notice the locking mechanism behaving any differently, and you'd really have to be using it hard. But technically speaking, you are putting wear on the locking mechanism and it's grinding it away. Even tempered steel, it still grinds away over time. But because you have this, you're cutting the work in half, which you could say essentially makes the locking mechanism last twice as long. But it goes even further than that. Not only do we have two parts that stop two separate forms of disengagement on the locking mechanism, this stop pin right here, which doesn't have to move, takes most of the brunt of the force from everything. So not only is it the stop pin that stops the blade from over-traveling, again, the lock bar, which otherwise would be taking in all of the shock and all the force from negative force going on the spine of the blade, it once again gets transferred back to the stop pin, which also shocks the blade itself. So it kind of goes in a loop almost as far as collision and shock waves go. That's getting very technical here, but essentially we have three parts: the tang of the blade, or the blade itself, you could say, the lock bar, and the stop pin, all sharing force together. Hence the term triad, tri meaning three. Maybe that's why they called it that, I'm assuming. But just because of having that in there, it makes it just that much stronger. It's very simple physics. It's kind of technical when you explain it that way, but essentially just because you put a stop pin in between the blade and the lock bar there, it makes it that much stronger. Like way, way, way stronger. It's extremely simple. It's funny to think that no one else tried that out, no one else patented it until Cold Steel started using it. I'm going to butcher this here, 2007, 2008, somewhere like the late 2000s. I don't remember exactly when it came out. I don't know. But it's funny, just because that one little stop pin in there, it makes all the difference. And then on top of that, again, Cold Steel happens to make their lock bars even longer, which makes disengaging them even harder. It's extremely strong. It's just as fast. There's absolutely no disadvantage I could think of that the Triad Lock has over the Lockback. I can't think of a single thing the Lockback has that is better than the Triad Lock. I can't do it. It's funny when you have different locking mechanisms. You say, okay, that's a liner lock, that's a frame lock. They all have advantages, disadvantages, but overall this one's better at this, that one's better at that. Triad Lock, flat out, is just better than the Lockback. So that's one of the reasons I love about it. That's why I love how Cold Steel puts it on so many of their folders. I just can't think of anything bad about it in comparison to Lockback. Nothing wrong with Lockbacks, though. They still work. They're still very strong. We're still using them today for a good reason. It's a great locking mechanism. But Cold Steel, Andrew Demko, improved it further, mainly by adding an integral stop pin in there. Very cool. Very simple. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more knife locking mechanism videos, I have plenty of them. You can check out my playlist. You can check out my channel. If you want to see knife reviews, knife videos, EDC gear videos, I have plenty more to check out. Feel free to subscribe if you wish. Thanks for watching. Mannix out.